André Leon Talley, ALT, a memoir. Vallard, New York Publishing. Copyrighted 2003, André Leon Talley. Chapter 1. I shall begin by writing about luxury. I can't be sure exactly what image you'd drum up, but I expect that it will be either swathed in silk and brocade, or dressed in a custom-made English suit. You have every right to suppose that is what I mean. After all, fashion is luxury. The luxury of the most beautiful fabrics, tailored to perfection. The luxury of the clothes presented at runway shows, beautifully orchestrated luncheons, or designers' showrooms. The luxury of having a lifestyle that permits one either the leisure to wear such clothes or the leisure to have an opinion about them. If I tell you I am going to write about luxury, perhaps you will think, André wants to write down what he learned from Diana Vreeland, that self-anointed queen of slander. Or André intends to memorialize the heyday of hedonism with the fashion elite. Or André is about to wax rapturous about the perfect lines of the bespoke shoe. And you wouldn't be wrong. Sooner or later, I'm going to talk about all those things, but they are not what I mean by luxury. The truth is that I have lived on a relatively grand scale because that's the way fashion is. By its very nature, it is larger than life. It's fickle, it's flamboyant, and it's fabulous. But at the same time, it does not provide the boundaries a person needs in order to live a sane, happy life in service not only to oneself, but also to others. Fashion is no substitute for family, and I do not believe I could ever have learned to appreciate haute couture had I not learned to appreciate simpler things first. Long before I became Miss Vreeland's assistant at the Costume Institute of New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, long before I became the Paris fashion editor at WWD, or Paris bureau chief at W, or creative director, and now once again an editor, at Vogue. I am an African-American man raised by his hard-working grandmother in North Carolina. My grandmother never tried to force me to subscribe to a particular code of behavior. By growing up in her house, I learned how to live just by watching her work, pray, and go about the business of making a home for me. My life was not easy, but because it was based on clear, sound principles of good behavior, it lacked the torture complexity that I now so often see around me. Her code of ethics, always unspoken, was nevertheless perfectly straightforward. Church and family, the focal points, were inexplicably bound together. She worked hard at her day job and kept a clean, welcoming home so that those in her care, her own mother and I, could be well provided for, and so that we could all serve God. What this meant at the practical level was that every surface in our home glowed, not only through the application of soap, paste wax, or ammonia, but also through the underlying working of love. What it also meant was that my childhood was, by anyone's standard, a rich one. Faith, hope, charity. Add luxury to the list because it was that important, taking that seriously in our home. My earliest experiences of luxury, then, were not experiences of surfeit and sumptuousness, but of the beauty of ordinary tasks done well, and in a good frame of mind, of simple things suited to their purpose and well cared for. I will get into evenings with Miss Vreeland eventually, and to New York in the 70s, and to the silk fi bespoke shoes. But for me, the only place to begin talking about luxury is with my grandmother's crisp white sheets. When I was a child, my great-grandmother China and my grandmother, when China became too frail, boiled our laundry in a big black iron cauldron in the yard. She would set everything up under our peach trees for shade. She would build a good fire from wood she had chopped herself. Sheets and table linens always had to be allowed to simmer, and anything white, such as towels, nightgowns, and my Sunday shirts, would be left to boil the longest. The temperature in that cauldron was so hot my great-grandmother or grandmother had to use a rod as thick as a forearm, cut from the limb of a tree, to stir the laundry around the enormous pot. Once clean, the wash was transferred to a huge zinc rinsing tub that rested either on the wooden table or on the tree stump that was normally reserved for the death whack or the neck of the soon-to-be-eaten chicken. The sheets and other whites gotten a weekly dose of bluing agent to prevent them from turning yellow. My grandmother, our great-grandmother, would wring them out thoroughly by hand before hanging them to dry. I can still see my grandmother, her apron full of cloth pins, walking the length of our silvery clothing line, which stretched all the way from the porch to the tree far at the back of the property. With a rag in hand, wiping the natural dust and pollens off the linens before she could entrust her laundry to it. The wall of white sheets flapped in the wind like huge sails rigged by wooden cloth pins. They stretched the entire length of our deep backyard, and I loved to run past and in between the drying sheets, feeling their roughness on my outstretched hands and inhaling the fresh smell of cotton drying in the open air. The convenience of a modern tumbling dryer doesn't really compensate for the loss of that wonderful smell. That warm, delicious odor came inside on the folded sheets, which my grandmother stacked shoulder high on the table, and then she ironed them. Remember that my grandmother was not a woman of leisure, no bored housewife searching for ways to occupy her time until she retired at 65. She worked 5 mornings a week at her job, and before she left to begin this hard work, she did a lot of hard work at home. On bitter, cold, frosty, and crusted mornings when I was a child, she would go outside with an axe to chop wood for the stove and our fires. I sometimes volunteered for this task, but she always said she could chop better or more quicker than I could. Her night headscarf would still be in place, protecting her curls, and she would be wearing nothing warmer than a pink quilted bed jacket over her flannel nightgown. After she chopped the wood, she started all the fires, put up a stirring breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, grits, and coffee, got me ready for school, and still managed to be at work at 7 a.m. On Sundays, she rose even earlier to make her special Sunday breakfast, which included cured country ham, sausages, and homemade biscuits. After all this work, and after performing manual labor all day, she came home not to rest on the sofa, but to do more work. Every Thursday evening, without fail, she ironed every sheet and pillowcase for 3 beds, hers, mine, and great-grandmama China's, until China passed on in January 1960. She did this with an old electric iron. I remember her standing at the ironing board for what seems like hours at a time, spritzing the sheets with water before she pressed them to make them more pliable. As late as 1983, I would sometimes iron my sheets as a form of therapeutic reconnection to my home. But to anyone with a modern sensibility, the idea of ironing sheets is unthinkable. Who has time when permanent press linens can be thrown in the washer and dryer then tossed on the bed? To my grandmother, however, pressed sheets were a necessity of a well-ran, tasteful home. If we could have that luxury, which cost her willingness for one more labor-intense task and the time it took to perform it, then she would see it that we did it. Her sheets were always plain white, but they were of high quality, thick Egyptian cotton, and they were always immaculate. Sheets like that are a true delight. Our house was often chilly in the winter, but there was no pleasure more delicious than climbing into a bed piled 6 deep with homemade quilts and snuggling down into those crispy, clean white sheets. Sleep was never so fine as between those sheets, cooked, ironed, and arranged by loving hands. Our house was full of simple luxuries. Until I left home, I never used a towel that hadn't been ironed. I had no idea how much I would miss them when I was out in the world. My boxer shorts, always white or pale blue for Sunday, were pressed smooth, my Sunday shirts starched to a shine. The handkerchiefs my grandmother would tuck into her purse before leaving for church were folded neat as letters, and the curtains in her house were quite plainly a joy to look out at the world through. In the kitchen she often had printed curtains, but the rest of the curtains were white organdy, with deep ruffles and tiebacks, the kind of curtains you only see in the movies about days gone by. At regular intervals she would ask that the curtains be taken down, one of the many household tasks for which my height particularly suited me, and would launder them so well that they dazzled the eye. Like everything else in the house, they were meticulously ironed and arranged. Even the lace doilies on the back of the chairs were starched. Of course, these luxuries are only luxuries if you see them that way. We always had clothes to wear and food on the table, but we lived on limited means. Our roof leaked buckets of water when the snow melted, and if the pipes froze, my grandmother heated water on the wooden burning stove so that I could take a bird bath before school. Of course, the toilet didn't flush during hard frozen spells, so at those times we took turns dumping buckets of water down the commode as a hygienic measure. The wind had a way of screaming through our pipe-thin walls, but my grandmother never lit a fire in her own bedroom at night. She always said this was for health reasons, and indeed I hardly ever remember her taking ill until she grew old. The love we had for one another was the only luxury we had in that house, but because of that love and because of my grandmother's faith, our simple life was suffered with dignity and grace. My grandmother taught me very early to seek out the clean lines of true elegance. Luxury is, in the greatest sense, in the grand sense, could be something as simple as watching 2 or 3 canaries cavorting outside my bedroom window, or receiving from my uncle's big, callous hands a basket of tomatoes freshly picked and still smelling of the salt and sunshine of the vine. It might be the glossy, store-bought bow on a birthday present wrapped in glossier paper from the 5 and dime. There was a tremendous beauty in the white picket fence that divided my grandmother's rose garden from her occasional experiments at vegetable gardening, especially when the fence stood up in the fall of the year against the blanket of scarlet and yellow sycamore leaves that drifted down to cover the yard. And though my grandmother had no formal training as a gardener, had never read a gardening book, and had no big bag of Miracle-Gro to assist her, her peach trees, rose bushes, and begonias were lush. and the terracotta pots of red geraniums she kept on our porch in the summer were among the finest in the neighborhood. She had a natural green thumb. Anything she touched blossomed. It was likely the very plainness of my grandmother's home that trained me to be an aesthete, not in the sense of someone who seeks out, like the protagonist of George Carl's Heinzman Against the Grain, even more rarefied aesthetic pleasures, but in the truer sense of one whose life is governed by his experience of a relationship to beauty. Certainly, by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, I was a luxury addict. I loved waking up on Sunday mornings, savoring my breakfast, and then carefully stepping into my best clothes. I loved watching my grandmother perform the ministration she did only on that day, the application of such wonder as powder and lipstick. And although I had rarely eaten in anyone else's kitchen, I knew it was a stroke of good fortune always to be presented with the delicious food she cooked for me. I will return to talk about it more fully later, as my grandmother's cooking was of such epic proportions that it deserves its own chapter. And when the beautiful things came into our house, they always made a profound impression on me. I will never forget the yellow paisley pajamas my grandmother bought me for my 12th birthday. Until that time, my pajamas had been like my underwear, white or pale blue cotton. But that year, for whatever reason, my grandmother went downtown to a Main Street store called Belk's and picked up these yellow cotton flannel Christian Dior pajamas. Christian Dior? She didn't know who he was. She just had an innate sense of what was beautiful. I, of course, knew perfectly well who Christian Dior was. I was already a devoted reader of fashion magazines such as Mrs. Vreeland's Vogue. I was greatly impressed by these exotic and unusual pajamas. They were lemon yellow with red and green paisley, and they were like anything I had ever seen. I decided to sleep in them only on special occasions, such as Christmas. I'm sure the pajamas were Christian Dior licensing. They couldn't have come all the way from Paris to Durham, North Carolina, but I also knew that they must have been expensive for my grandmother's salary as a maid. She knew that the occasional taste of true luxury is very important. She was always scrupulous about budgeting and saving, but after her husband died in 1951, she bought herself a diamond ring he could not afford when they were courting. Also, after his death, she purchased a sterling silver flatware service for $12, which we used only for extremely important occasions, such as when the minister came for dinner. Her pleasure in the silverware was not vanity, but true pride of having worked hard to bring something lovely into her life. Since my childhood, I have eaten from silverware far more costly and ornate than my grandmother's, but I have never known a host to take such uncomplicated pleasure in its beauty as she did. I loved to watch her enjoy these things, and when I became old enough, I had some money of my own, I took pleasure in spending it on her. When I was living at home during my college years at North Carolina Central University, I used to go to Washington, D.C. in the summertime to work as a park ranger at such places as Lincoln Memorial. My father, William Carroll Talley, had worked 2 jobs in his entire life. By day, a mid-grade level printing press operator at the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, and at night as a taxi driver to help support me. After 6, he didn't have a cocktail hour, and he rarely got to travel, even on the weekends. Other than his Sunday morning church-going and his Masonic Lodge meetings, he took little time off from work. He kept 2 cars, though, a sleek, sporty car for his playboy life, and a cab all his own. I admired his hard work and dedication, and through them, he had saved enough to pay for my tuition to State University. However, my grandmother and I agreed that I would have to earn the money for my other expenses. Whatever I earned in the summertime was to be my spending money for the year to come. And of course, I saved enough of it to buy myself books and some clothes, and things that a 20-year-old valued. But what I really liked to do with whatever was left over was spoil my grandmother. Each August before I returned home to Durham, I would visit Garfinkel's department store, which was over by the White House, and pick out 2 or 3 pairs of Kislev gloves for her. Garfinkel's was to Washington what Bergdorf's was to Fifth Avenue, and everything it carried was the best of the best. Kislev gloves were considered the finest gloves made. And remember, this was the late 60s, when no woman's formal outfit was complete without matching gloves. Kislev made hundreds of styles for day and evening wear. Bone-colored wrist-length gloves as soft as kimois, elbow-length gloves in black or white kidskin, shoulder-high evening gloves that could be crushed stylishly down to just above the elbow. They were expensive, around $20 a pair, which was a lot of money back then, but it gave me pleasure to bring home a couple of beautiful new pairs for my grandmother. It was a joy to watch her unwrap them, exclaim over them, and place them carefully in the glove drawer, and the pleasure she took in wearing them was nearly palpable. Of course, once I began working in fashion, I was able to send her truly extravagant gifts, suits and handbags from Chanel, and the finest crepe de chine from Karl Lagerfeld. All manners of classic, well-made shoes. But try as I might, I could never actually manage to spoil her. She had her priorities too straight for that. However lovely a dress I managed to buy her, she always valued the love behind the gift more than the gift itself. My grandmother's impeccable sense of order and her pride in the beauty of her home cultivated in me a real appreciation for the importance of good housekeeping. When in my late 20s I came under Mrs. Vreeland's tutelage, I had very little direct experience with the kind of luxury she practically embodied, yet found that I had an innate understanding of it. Take, for example, Mrs. Vreeland's sheets. Now, in my childhood, I had had a true understanding of luxury when I looked through my grandmother's cedar chest, packed with neatly folded, beautiful linen. But nothing in my childhood had prepared me for Mrs. Vreeland's linen closet, an entire walk-in closet, given over to floor-to-ceiling shelves, packed with the exquisite linens she had collected over a lifetime. Most of them slept in individual zipped plastic cases. They had little handwriting labels on the shelves. Mademoiselle Porthal gift, 1965, white sheets with broderie anglaise, sheets embroidered by nuns in Portugal, 1939. She had sheets and patterns so wild I couldn't see how anyone could sleep in them. She had once seen some sheets that Madame Porthal had custom-made for Barbara Holton and spoke rapturously of them for the rest of her life. Mademoiselle Porthal was, in the mid of the last century, the reigning queen of French linen. She made the tablecloths for the Kennedy White House. These sheets, apparently, had had the biggest foldbacks Mrs. Vreeland had ever seen, all hand-embroidered with Le Douanier Rousseau's jungle scene. Miss Vreeland raved about the savage tigers, lions, and exotic foliage. She went on about them as someone else might go on about a new lover. But a perfectly made bed was important to her, exactly as it was to my grandmother, and that is how I learned to appreciate the extravagance of her linen closet. Her taste may have been more expensive than any we had known in North Carolina, but the simple pleasure she derived from them was the same. When Miss Vreeland grew older and fell ill, she would still, when I went to visit her, be perfectly turned down, lying on an impeccable turned-down bed. It didn't matter that she couldn't hardly see her colorful sheets anymore. She was happy in the knowledge that the bed was correct in every layer of porthole. I realize now that my grandmother and Mrs. Vreeland had similar ways of appreciating luxury, because they both believed in the importance of its most essential underpinnings. Polish. And I do mean polish in the literal sense. Once I got old enough to help with household chores, my grandmother taught me not only to clean things, but to make them shine. In the summer, I would take all the gliders, chairs, and pots of geraniums, ferns, and sun-dried flowers from the porch, scrub the floor and railings down with soapy water and a push broom, and pour bucket after bucket of clean rinsing water over everything until I could see my reflection in the pearl gray paint. Lathering up a big plank floor like that was no mean feat, and neither was changing the rinse bucket of cold water 3 to 5 times. Though when I had finished the task, it made me very, very proud. Polishing the furniture was one of my weekly tasks, as was sweeping the wooden floors. You didn't sweep under a bed in my grandmother's house. You moved the bedstead as far as was necessary to get the dust and dirt beneath. At Christmas and Easter, we got down on our hands and knees and polished the floors with paste wax. We washed the window panes, both inside and out, with rags and ammonia. Spring cleaning was the time to embrace the renewal spirit of Easter, with blue Windex and spray bottles and Clorox in buckets. With our cleaning rags and scouring pads, we attacked dust and grime in combat mode, making sure that every molding, every window sash, every doorknob gleamed. One of my favorite occasional chores as a child was repapering the cabinet in which my grandmother kept the magical essence, such as lemon and vanilla abstract, with which she baked. I took my time at this task and stopped to open and smell each bottle before I returned it to its place. This was also the cabinet in which she kept our supplies of household remedies, some of which, horse liniments for aching joints and the cod liver oil I swallowed grimacing every morning, had such pungent odors I made sure the bottle remained tightly capped. I would cover those shelves in bright, festive ginghams, optimistic 5 and dime decorations. Like any dreamer, I loved to loll, and there were days when I didn't want to get out of bed or dawdled at jobs my grandmother asked for me to do. Mostly, I accepted her matter-of-fact attitude towards her housework without a second thought. In our family, cleanliness was so close to godliness that we plain had no congress with grime. We cleaned simply because cleaning had to be done. The necessity of an immaculate house was not shrouded in philosophy. It was neither something on which we should pride ourselves, nor a burden we should stoically bear, but a key part of good living. My grandmother thought that preaching belonged in church, so she never sat me down and explained this. Benny Francis Davis did neither more nor less than set me an example that I could follow without question. Through soap and paste wax, rags, mops, and muscle power, I learned that cleaning can itself be restful, and that a well-kept home soothes the mind and spirit, making it easier to contemplate things beyond the physical and the everyday. Mrs. Vreeland's house was every bit as neat and clean as my grandmother's, and while she did little of the work herself, she oversaw it with interest and took real pleasure in its results. With a seemingly endless rotation of part-time workers, she managed to keep house as another might with a full live-in staff of 30. The maids were constantly busy rubbing and scrubbing her furniture in bibelots. The cushions on the couch were always perfectly arranged, with a dent in the center of each. None of her ordinary retainers was allowed to touch her bookshelves, but once a week a college student came to dust and reshelve her books. He tended them as carefully as if they were the stacks of the Library of Congress. I once saw Mrs. Vreeland's French maid, Yvonne, carefully ironing a small stack of $5 bills before they went into her black silk evening bag. A young man came in on Saturdays to see Miss Vreeland's shoes, which he buffed to a meticulous shine. Once the uppers were as glassy as a still alpine lake, he would polish the soles with a rhinoceros horn. He took care of the soles of Mrs. Vreeland's shoes the way some people look after their family silver. And how she loved it. She really did notice the soles of people's shoes. I came to her house for dinner one night in a pair of pink raw silk Manolo Blahnik Chinese slippers, and as we were relaxing after supper, I crossed my legs. "André!" she exclaimed. Her eyes widened in an almost kabuki expression of surprise. "The next time you come to dinner in those slippers, I want to see the soles polished. When you cross your legs, you must present the same perfection you do in having selected this magnificent fabric for your shoes. There are people from whom such a statement would be a mark of rampant vanity, of a total lack of connection with the world in which the rest of us live. But Diana Vreeland was as well moored as anyone I've known. She loved beauty. That was all. And unlike most of its devotees in this world, she was less likely to fall into raptures over a beautiful vista or a beautiful face, though she loved those things too, than over a beautiful example of artifice. To her, the Chrysler Building was as awe-inspiring as any cliff overlooking the Hudson, largely because it had sprung from the imagination of human being who had to coax it into reality through the use of materials as well as dreams. She valued craftsmanship and set great store by both the spark of inspiration and the dogged hard work that brought a painting, a gown, or a well-set table into being. I don't think she made a qualitative distinction between things that were magnificent because they were art and things that were simply magnificent. Thus, she was a fan of any lovely thing that required care in its preparation. Linen sheets, soufflés, chamber music, a manicured garden. These are old-fashioned pleasures, and they require an old-fashioned investment of time and sweat. The so-called convenience of the modern world tend to be the things that Miss Vreeland either lamented during her lifetime, no wax floors, no iron fabrics, or would have disliked had she lived long enough to see them, casual Fridays or shabby chic. Thus, when Miss Vreeland admonished me about the soles of my shoes, I know that she was not being faithful to empty form. Rather, she was offering me one more lesson in the way of living well-rut, elegant life. What good does it do, she was asking at some level, to be groomed in the places that are visible to others if the hidden parts of you remain unkept? I think that what she was asking of me was that I polish myself in every way possible, from the soles of my shoes to the deep recesses of my mind. At least this is how I always understood both my grandmother's and Mrs. Vreeland's insistence on clothes being painstakingly cared for. Miss Vreeland, for example, had a system for how evening clothes should be prepared when she was going to wear them. If she knew she had a dinner to attend on Wednesday, Yvonne would lay the dress out on Monday to air. When Mr. Vreeland had passed away, Miss Vreeland had converted his bedroom into a dressing room, and in it was a chaise lounge, on which the clothes would be carefully arranged on white tissue. Sometimes, if she had events 2 evenings in a row, 2 outfits would be laid out, as if having a conversation with each other. This was an important part of her sensibility, and it was almost in Jane Austen kind of sensibility, this notion that clothes would have to be aired for 2 days before they could be worn. Thus, the kind of idiosyncrasy that makes life wonderful and luxurious. And to me, it never seemed all that idiosyncratic, because my grandmother had a similar code. Not about everyday clothes, like Miss Vreeland. She wore only tidy clothes, but the things she wore to work were always utilitarian, nothing much. About church clothes, however, she had a particular code of honor. On Saturdays, when we finished straightening up the house, we would take out our clothes for the next day, right down to my socks, navy, underwear, pale blue, and lay them atop the cedar chest in which the linens were stored. I was used to airing clothes by the time I met Miss Vreeland. I'd been doing it all my life. My grandmother took tremendous pride in our appearance on Sundays. We did not have extravagant clothes, but we were always the pattern of respectability. My suits were always navy blue, my shirts white or light blue, their collars starched until they nearly cut me. I always had a pair of black or cordovan Oxfords for church, and I shined them on Saturday. My grandmother dressed beautifully for church. I remember being in her bedroom when she placed her clothes out the night before, and marveling at all the foundation garments, girdles, corsets, slips, and so forth, that underpinned her Sunday appearance and effortless elegance. She too generally wore a suit on Sundays. Her favorite, and the one in which I remember her most often, was a simple black woolen Barathia suit with a 3-button jacket and a skirt. She must have bought that suit in the 1940s, and she continued to wear it until she died in 1989. It was unassuming, but it was a classic, of which she took appropriate good care. She had a collection of hats, ranging from the subdued to the fanciful, each stored in its own box, and she never went to church without wearing one. Her shoes always matched her handbag. We were so well turned out on an ordinary Sunday that you might almost say we were showboating, except that my grandmother would have dismissed the accusation with a brisk shake of the head. We loved our church clothes, and loved the sense of occasion they gave to our lives. When we returned home after church, we changed right out of them before we sat down to our big Sunday meal. I think that's where the luxury came in. Some people love fancy cars, and we loved our beautiful church clothes. We derived pleasure from folding and hanging them up and saving them for our intended purpose. My grandmother never had to tell me to stand up proud, never had to explain to me or convince me that although we did not have much money, we were the equals to any people in town. I knew this just by looking around. When I saw the beauty of our home and the many small luxuries with which we were blessed, when I took pride in our appearance on Sundays, I knew my place in the world. Perhaps that's why, when I came to live in the whirlwind world of fashion, I was able to stand my ground and never lose sight of the importance of family, religion, and the other basic values I learned as a child. And perhaps it is why I am able to see Mrs. Vreeland's love of polish and shine as evidence of a deeper philosophy. The premise of home and the importance of spending time in its service, rather than slavish devotion to the superficial. Miss Vreeland kept her shoes for life, her bags for life, and her friends for life. My grandmother did the same. The pace of the world has accelerated since my grandmother and Mrs. Vreeland were young women, and it would be unrealistic to think that one could live today exactly as they did 50 or 70 years ago. When I was a boy or a young man, it was pleasant to go for long walks or drives knowing that no one could contact me during this private time. Yet, I am glad for my cellular phone. As much as I love iron sheets, as strong as the sense memory of their texture and smell remains, I don't have time to iron an entire bed's worth weekly and usually find myself sleeping on the same permanent press sheets that everyone else uses nowadays. I do love hotels, however, for their crisp linen, and it's always a great pleasure to stay at Karl Lagerfeld's home in France, not only because he has a grand and most gracious host and a good friend, but because his laundry maid, Annette, a white-haired woman who wears a pink candy-striped uniform, knows how to do sheets. Annette gives that same care to the tablecloths, tea napkins, coasters of embroidered linens, and one's personal laundry. Even as someone who never really learned to cook, I cannot imagine having the time to chop wood and stoke the fire in the stove, no matter how much better cakes taste coming out of a wood-burning oven. The lives my grandmother and Mrs. Vreeland lived seem superficially different from one another, but their faith in their beliefs and their ability to bring beauty and joy into the life of those they loved were very much the same. I am lucky to have known the luxury of a peach still warm from the tree, lucky to have known the luxury of polishing the soles of my shoes. You are not the car you drive, the clothes you wear, or the perks you acquire in your line of work. Neither are you the clothes you do not wear, the perks in which you do not have access. Human kindness is what matters. The luxury of taking the time to say a kind word or to perform a kind deed. That is the only thing that can truly make one's day a day of enrichment.